Hello everyone, my name is Thomas, and today in this video we're going to be going over the introductory information to get you started with audio. In this video we're going to be going over items such as sample rate, bit depth, the difference between stereo and mono, as well as some of the basic physics of sound. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, what is sound? Well, sound is just the vibrations of the air, and those vibrations travel through the air into our ears. They vibrate our eardrums, and that's what we interpret as sound. Now, sound has an anatomy to it. This is just a basic wave diagram. And at the top here, over here, we have our peak. We have our peak, and at the bottom here, we have our trough, T-R-O-U-G-H. And sound has a baseline, and that's where the peaks and troughs are measured from. So, the distance from the baseline to the peak, or the baseline to the trough, that is what's known as amplitude. And what our amplitude measures is the loudness. And the next thing that we're going to be talking about is a cycle. Now, what a cycle is basically returning to a point that you started on. Now, this could be from baseline to baseline, and the reason that we're going to this baseline over here rather than this one is because this is a return to a baseline to peak rather than a baseline to trough. So this is another peak. So we can either have baseline to baseline, we can have peak to peak, or if I completed this, trough to trough. Either way, the distance from here to here, this is a cycle. Now, the reason that cycles are important is because the number of cycles that happen over a second is what determines the frequency of a wave. So, frequency, and that's what's considered our pitch. So, actually I'll draw it down here. So, a very tight frequency, a lot of cycles happening over and over again. See how these peaks are really, really close to each other. This would raise the pitch. Things like dog whistles, they have super, super, super high pitches. So high that the human ear can barely hear it. But to a dog, they have much more sensitive hearing, and therefore they can hear it a lot more clearly than we can. Things like a bass, or even just, normal instruments that we hear on a day-to-day basis, they have much longer cycles, over a second. Say this right here is 1 second. The distance from this to this is 1 second. Well, here we have 20 peaks happening in a second versus here where we only see 3.5 peaks in a second. So this would have a much lower frequency or a much lower pitch. Now, in reality, these are not what sound waves actually look like. Sound waves are a lot messier, and it's only on specific instruments that are designed to play a single pitch, for example, a tuning machine, that you would be able to see these kinds of waves on an oscilloscope. An oscilloscope is a device that can visualize sound waves. They can show you what the waves look like. And you would see these kinds of waves, what are called sine waves, only if a single continuous pitch was being played. In reality, sound pitches are very messy, and they almost look like a signature. They're just absolutely everywhere. But those differences, those rapid changes in pitch and frequency and amplitude, now these rapid changes in the frequency and the amplitude are what gives a sound its timbre. And I know it's very easy to want to call it timbre, but it's timbre. And this is what's called the texture of sound, is how I've heard it described. It's what makes, for example, a C, the note C on a violin sound different from a C on a piano. On average, they're the same frequency. but their lines, their oscilloscope lines, their visualization looks completely different. And that's what makes a violin sound like a violin and a piano sound like a piano. So with all of this, first thing that we're going to be talking about is sample rate. We have a theoretical wave. This is a sound, a vibration, and it has an infinite amount of information in it. The first thing that we're going to be talking about is sample rate. Now, when something is converted from analog to digital, there has to be some sort of recreation of what is going on. Now, what's going on is whatever is doing the conversion from analog signals, the vibrations in the air, to electrical signals that our computer can read, it has to use sample rate to reconstruct a wave. So I've made sort of a little visualization of what that looks like. What each of these bars is a sample. Now, the number of samples that the analog to digital converter performs is your sample rate. And what it's doing is taking a little screenshot of each of these points. Every time a bar touches the line, that's a little point that it takes into consideration. It says, okay, at this point in time, it's at this amplitude. At this point in time, fractions of a second later, it says the audio is at this amplitude, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. And what it does is it does its best to recreate the wave as best as it can. Now, this is a relatively low sample rate, and it doesn't do an amazing job of recreating what's going on, because, here we have points where what is actually being played and what it's actually at are very, very different apart. Or in cases of like over here, this makes it look like it's a falling amplitude, but in reality it's a rising amplitude. And it's not till we get to this point, this line right here, this vertical line, that it finally corrects itself and goes, oh, this is where I actually should be. So what would fix that is a higher sample rate. Say we can measure every half of one of these lines, measure here, here, and here. Well, I've done that right here. And so now we're measuring every half of one of these bars twice as fast, double the sample rate. So as you can see, we get a lot closer to that line. A lot more of the time, we're much closer to the line. We have cases right here where it's a little bit skewed, but overall, this is following the line a lot closer than the previous one. If you remember about right here, this is where it was a falling frequency, when this was actually a rising curve. And we can see here that we follow the line a lot closer. And so if we look at this new line, we can see that it's a much closer representation to what's actually going on, and that's what sample rate is. The higher the sample rate, the closer to the original analog audio that you will hear. Now, this is kind of a case of diminishing returns, to where the higher the sample rate you go, the less and less difference you'll hear. So you can have it to where you have 1 million samples, and every single point on this line is mapped out perfectly, to where you have a near perfect recreation of that audio. Now, the problem with that is that you'll find that that takes a lot more memory, that takes a lot more computing power to process all of that information. You have a ton of data going through these lines, and it's just impossible for a computer to deal with all of that information as perfectly as you would hear it outdoors. And so the point is to get as close to this line as possible while maintaining the speed of your computer. Your computer can handle so much data at once, and your job is to get it as close to that limit as possible without completely slowing down your computer. That's why when we look at sample rate, here we have, as low as 6,000 hertz, and we can see here that it would be the equivalent of using something like this to work with your media. Now, you can go as high as 192,000 hertz. Now, what a hertz is the number of cycles completed over a certain period of time. Now, the difference between mono and stereo is how it's recorded. So simple mics like your cell phone or a headset or something very simple will probably record in mono. These types of microphones only record a single channel, and a channel is essentially just a space for recording. So in mono, you only have one channel of audio. So imagine this, and then you have your bass line, and then you have a line that goes up and down, blah, blah, blah. And so your channel of audio looks like this. So when it gets to your headphones or your speakers, what it'll do is it'll take this single channel of audio and duplicate it. So that way now it's 2 channels. And this will play in the right ear, and this one will play in the left ear, or in the right speaker or the left speaker. But it's the same audio. Wherever it's coming from, it all sounds the same. Now, when you record in stereo, you have 2 channels of audio. And these types of microphones come with 2 different microphones. They come in various different orientations and sensitivities and directional sensitivity. These come in a variety of different types and shapes and whatnot. But the point is that you have multiple microphones picking up similar but slightly different data. And so when it gets to your headphones, or when you put it in the software, what it'll do is it'll play this one in the right and this one in the left. And you'll have a sort of directionality, because something, for example, if you're in an orchestra, if you're here and you have an orchestra playing around you, over on the right side, you'll have cellos and basses, and then in the centers you'll have violas, and then you have your second violins, and then you have your first violins, and then you have all the other instruments behind them and whatnot. If you are here and you have a microphone right here, the stuff on the right, stuff like the cellos and the violas, they'll come in a little louder on this right microphone, or the microphone that's pointed towards the right. And the violins over here will come in on the left side louder. And so when you put this through your speakers, it creates a sense of space. On the right side, you can hear the deeper instruments more than you can hear the higher pitched instruments like the violins, and you can kind of create a space from which you hear something. And so that's really the main benefit of stereo audio, is that you create a sense of space, and it's a lot more in-depth than your traditional just mono audio. Now you can kind of create a pseudo stereo effect with mono. Now you can create a sort of pseudo stereo effect with mono signals by duplicating it and then shifting it off ever so slightly. Just moving it by a couple of samples, and you can create a more resonance, a more reverbed space. It makes the sound a little bolder, a little bigger than it actually is. And so that's a method that we'll get into at a later date. But that's the big difference between mono and stereo audio. Now, 5:1 is a less used, it is still used, but it's less used for common purposes. What 5:1 audio is for home theaters and regular theaters. Now, this kind of stuff is designed for movie purposes. You'll often see movies will often create mixes, which are the final product of audio, where you have different sounds coming from different positions. So you're in your home theater and you're on your couch, and the screen is over here. Well, you might have a speaker here. That was terrible. Speaker pointed this way, speaker pointed this way, one here, and then the other one can kind of be anywhere you want it to be. If you want it to be behind you, which often is what they do in movie theaters, or you could have it in front of you, or as a sort of sound bar underneath your TV. And so what you can do is create an even greater sense of space inside of your home, because you have certain sounds not only coming from in front of you but to the left of you, and so you get sound from over here, and you get sound from over here, and you get a different set of sounds from over here. And it functions a lot like how we hear audio in the real world, kind of how we can locate the sound of birds. Even though we can't see the birds, we know what direction they're in because of the way the sound bounces off all the surfaces, and we can kind of guess where the sound is coming from, even if we can't see it. And so 5:1 is a pretty niche but a very important method of creating sound. And so you'll have 5 different channels of audio, each with its own unique set of sound. But that'll do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. You have a good one.